Every great dynasty has a story it tells about itself. For the House of Hohenzollern, the royal family that ruled Prussia, and then the German Empire, that story was forged in iron and written in blood. It was a saga of duty, discipline, military conquest, and unwavering resolve. To be a Hohenzollern prince was to be born not just into a family, but into a brand, a living symbol of German strength and imperial destiny. You were expected to be a pillar of this grand edifice, impeccable in conduct, Spartan in habit, and absolutely loyal to the crown. But what happens when a pillar is cracked? What happens when a prince, born and bred to be a paragon of Prussian virtue, decides he would rather be a jester? This is the story of Prince Friedrich Leopold of Prussia, a man who stood just a few heartbeats from the imperial throne, but seemed determined to blowtorch the very foundations of his own house. His life was a spectacular rebellion against the rigid world that created him, a cascade of scandals, debts, and open defiance that horrified his family. His downfall was not the result of war or revolution, but a cold, calculated act of familial destruction orchestrated by the most powerful man in Europe, his own cousin and brother-in-law, Kaiser Wilhelm II. This is the story of how a prince of Prussia was disowned, declared a fool, and effectively imprisoned by his own kin, a personal tragedy that served as a dark and prophetic preview of the coming collapse of the German Empire itself. To truly grasp the astonishing nature of Prince Friedrich Leopold's fall from grace, we must first understand the monumental structure from which he fell. The German Empire, proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in 1871, was the dominant power on the European continent. It was a new nation, but one built upon the ancient and formidable foundations of the Kingdom of Prussia. And Prussia was, above all else, an army with a state attached. The values of the Prussian military, order, obedience, efficiency, and an almost religious reverence for hierarchy, permeated every aspect of society. The House of Hohenzollern, which had methodically transformed its small electorate of Brandenburg into a sprawling kingdom and then a mighty empire, sat at the absolute apex of this rigid structure. The ethos of this world was personified by the first German emperor, Wilhelm I, a sober, dignified, and quintessentially Prussian monarch. But the true architect of his empire was the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, who had united Germany not through liberalism or debate, but through a deliberate policy of iron and blood. This legacy created a nation that was immensely powerful and wealthy, a leader in science, industry, and philosophy, but also one that was deeply authoritarian and militaristic. The German aristocracy, particularly the Prussian landowning class, known as the Junkers, formed the bedrock of the officer corps and the civil service, ensuring that this conservative martial spirit was preserved. It was into this world in 1865 that Prince Joachim Karl Wilhelm Friedrich Leopold was born. His lineage was impeccable. He was a prince of Prussia, a direct descendant of the Hohenzollern kings. His grandfather was Prince Charles of Prussia, a son of King Friedrich Wilhelm III. His great-uncle was the reigning Emperor Wilhelm I. More significantly, his father was Prince Friedrich Karl of Prussia, one of the most celebrated military commanders of his generation. Known as the Red Prince for the distinctive red uniform of his hussar regiment, Friedrich Karl was a decorated field marshal, a hero of the wars of German unification, who was famous for his tactical brilliance and his stern, demanding nature. To be the son of such a man was to be born in the shadow of a national monument, with the crushing expectation that you would one day live up to his legendary reputation. The upbringing of a Prussian prince in this era was a finely tuned process designed to stamp out frivolity and instill an iron sense of duty. From the earliest age, Friedrich Leopold's life would have been governed by a strict regimen of tutoring, religious instruction, and above all, military drills. Personal expression, emotional indulgence, and idle leisure were viewed with suspicion. The goal was to produce a perfect component for the imperial machine, a prince who understood that his life was not his own, but belonged entirely to the state, the army, and the crown. But from early on, there were signs that Friedrich Leopold was not a standard-issue component. He possessed a restless energy, a quick wit, and a mischievous streak that chafed against the solemnity of his environment. He was charming and intelligent, but he lacked the solemn, almost grim sense of purpose that defined his peers. He was a square peg being hammered relentlessly into a round hole. This fundamental conflict between his innate character and the rigid expectations of his station would become the central, tragic theme of his entire life. He was a child of the gilded cage, but instead of accepting his place, he would spend his life rattling the bars, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the zookeeper was the most powerful man in the world. As was preordained, Friedrich Leopold's life became formally intertwined with the two great pillars of the Prussian state, the army and a strategic dynastic marriage. He began his military service as a young man, receiving his commission in the most elite and socially significant unit in the entire German army, the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards. Stationed in the imperial capital of Potsdam, this regiment was the training ground for the future leaders of the Prussian military and the inner circle of the Hohenzollern court. Its officers were exclusively drawn from the highest echelons of the aristocracy. Life as a young guard officer was a strange mix of grueling physical training and demanding ceremonial duties, combined with an endless calendar of high society balls, hunts, and dinners. It was here that a prince's reputation was made or broken. Friedrich Leopold initially seemed to thrive. He was a capable officer who rose steadily through the ranks, and his natural charm made him a popular figure. But even here, his nonconformist nature began to surface in small ways, in a joke told at the wrong moment, a breach of protocol, or a general air of nonchalance that contrasted sharply with the ramrod straight seriousness of his fellow officers. The second pillar was put in place in 1889 with his marriage to Princess Louise Sophie of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Augustenburg. On the surface, this was a brilliant match. It united two important German princely houses and was celebrated with all the pomp and circumstance the empire could muster. But this marriage was far more than a simple love match. It was politically charged. Louise Sophie's family, the Augustenburgs, had been at the center of the Schleswig-Holstein question, a complex territorial dispute that Bismarck had used as a pretext for the war against Denmark in 1864, a key step in his plan for German unification. The Prussians had ultimately seized the duchies, leaving the Augustenburgs dispossessed and resentful. This marriage was intended to be a grand act of reconciliation, a symbol of unity under the Prussian crown. More importantly, the marriage created a direct and inescapable family bond with the man who was now the center of Friedrich Leopold's universe, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiserin, Augusta Victoria, was Louise Sophie's elder sister. This made the prince the Kaiser's brother-in-law. This intimate connection placed Friedrich Leopold in the absolute inner circle of imperial power. It also placed him under the constant, unblinking scrutiny of a man who was his temperamental opposite in every conceivable way. By the time of the marriage, Wilhelm II had been on the throne for a year, and his personality was already stamping itself upon the nation. The Kaiser was bombastic, insecure, and possessed of a volcanic energy. He was obsessed with military display, with uniforms, parades, and the grand theater of power. He was also deeply insecure, quick to take offense, and demanded fawning, sycophantic loyalty from those around him. He had no patience for irony, subtlety, or dissent. Friedrich Leopold, with his casual wit, his independent streak, and his growing disregard for convention, was like a stone in the Kaiser's perfectly polished jackboot. From the very beginning, the seeds of a monumental family feud were sown. The marriage intended to bind the families together would instead provide the arena for a bitter and destructive personal war. With his status secured by his military rank and his marriage, Prince Friedrich Leopold was granted his own domain. He became the master of Glienicke Palace, a stunning neoclassical villa located on the banks of the Havel River, near the imperial capital of Potsdam. Originally designed by the great architect Karl Friedrich Schinkel, Glienicke was an architectural masterpiece, an Italian-style dream set amidst exquisitely landscaped gardens. For the first time, the prince had a space that was truly his own, a stage where he could live out his fantasies far from the disapproving eyes of the main court. And it was here, in this idyllic setting, that his journey toward self-destruction began in earnest. Friedrich Leopold was afflicted with a restless, almost manic desire for novelty and opulence. He embarked on a series of wildly ambitious and ruinously expensive renovations at Glienicke. He was not content to merely preserve the palace. He had to remake it in his own extravagant image. He added a new wing to the palace, built a lavish new gatehouse, and even constructed an enormous, ornate water tower in the style of an Italian campanile, a structure that was both functionally unnecessary and astronomically costly. He commissioned a casino, a bowling alley, and expanded the stables, filling them with expensive racehorses. His most famous folly was the Curiosity Court, an imitation of a Pompeian courtyard which he filled with a vast and eclectic collection of art and artifacts, some valuable, many of them kitsch. This spending was fueled by an almost complete lack of financial sense. The prince saw his vast inheritance not as a trust to be managed, but as a bottomless pit of cash to fund his every whim. He became a fixture at the high-stakes gambling tables of Europe, particularly in Monte Carlo, where he was known to lose fortunes in a single night. He was also a magnet for fraudsters and con artists, who sold him on a series of disastrous investment schemes. He poured money into everything from non-existent gold mines in South America to fantastical perpetual motion machines, always convinced that the next venture would be the one to finally solve his financial woes. Alongside this financial recklessness came an escalation in his bizarre behavior. His practical jokes became more elaborate and more mean-spirited. He installed trick furniture in his palace designed to collapse under his guests. He delighted in serving food that looked real but was made of inedible substances. These were not the harmless pranks of a high-spirited young man. They were the calculated provocations of someone who seemed to derive pleasure from the embarrassment and discomfort of others, a way of asserting his power and contempt for the stiff social codes he was supposed to uphold. These antics, combined with his constant need for money, made him a pariah in the formal world of the Prussian court. The whispers of disapproval grew into open condemnation, and most importantly, they drew the ever-increasing wrath of his cousin, the Kaiser. For Wilhelm II, this behavior was not just a personal failing. It was an act of treason against the dignity and prestige of the House of Hohenzollern. The battle lines were being drawn, and the master of Glienicke was setting the stage for his own spectacular ruin. And so, the master of Glienicke Palace Prince Friedrich Leopold of Prussia, had, by the final decade of the 19th century, established himself as a man of boundless appetites and questionable judgment. On the surface, he remained a perfect pillar of the German Empire, a high-ranking general, husband to a well-connected princess, and master of one of the most beautiful estates in the kingdom. But beneath this glittering facade, the cracks were rapidly spreading. His life was becoming a whirlwind of reckless spending, childish provocations, and a growing disregard for the ironclad rules of his station. This behavior was more than just eccentricity. In the rigid, unforgiving world of the Hohenzollern court, it was a declaration of war. And the target of that war, whether the prince fully understood it or not, was the most powerful and dangerously thin-skinned man in Germany, his cousin and brother-in-law, the all-highest warlord, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The stage was set for a monumental imperial feud, a deeply personal and vicious conflict that would not end until one of them was utterly broken. To comprehend the sheer destructive force of this family feud, one must first step inside the claustrophobic and theatrical world of Kaiser Wilhelm II's court. It was a universe that revolved entirely around the whims, moods, and obsessions of one man. Wilhelm II was not a quiet constitutional monarch. He was a bombastic, swaggering emperor who believed with every fiber of his being in his divine right to rule. His personality was a volatile cocktail of intelligence, insecurity, and a deep-seated inferiority complex, stemming in part from the trauma of his difficult birth, which had left him with a permanently withered left arm. To compensate for this physical defect, which he saw as a profound personal failing, he cultivated an obsession with military strength and hypermasculinity. His court reflected this obsession. It was less a center of governance and culture and more a gigantic mobile officers' mess. The dominant figures were not politicians or artists, but generals and admirals. The prevailing fashion was the military uniform, which the Kaiser changed multiple times a day. The prevailing atmosphere was one of stern formality, unquestioning obedience, and a suffocating fear of displeasing the emperor. Wilhelm was notoriously unpredictable, prone to fits of rage over the smallest perceived slight. He surrounded himself with a sycophantic inner circle, the Hofkammerilla, who flattered his ego and insulated him from criticism. He had no tolerance for dissent, and he possessed a particularly venomous disdain for irony or sarcasm, which he was incapable of understanding. This was the world Friedrich Leopold was expected to navigate, a minefield of protocol where any misstep could lead to imperial oblivion. Into this world strode Prince Friedrich Leopold. Where the Kaiser was rigid, the prince was nonchalant. Where the Kaiser demanded fawning praise, the prince offered witty, often sarcastic, commentary. Where the Kaiser saw the world in the stark black and white terms of a parade ground, the prince saw it in shades of gray, ripe for amusement and provocation. Their personalities were not just different, they were fundamentally antagonistic. The Kaiser saw his cousin's behavior not as a mere personality quirk, but as a direct personal insult and a threat to the stability of the throne. He saw the prince's informality as a mockery of the imperial dignity he fought so hard to project. Every lavish party at Glienicke, every gambling debt reported in the foreign press, every ill-advised joke was a fresh log on the fire of the Kaiser's burning resentment. The conflict, which had been simmering for years, began to boil over into a series of public and semi-public scandals that horrified the court and delighted the foreign press. The prince's finances, already in a perilous state, tipped over into a full-blown crisis. He was borrowing enormous sums from international financiers, using his royal status and his vast estates as collateral. For the Kaiser, this was an intolerable situation. A Hohenzollern prince deep in debt to foreign bankers was not just a family embarrassment, it was a matter of state security. Such a man was vulnerable to blackmail, his loyalty potentially compromised. Furthermore, the specter of a Prince of Prussia being publicly sued by his creditors was a humiliation that Wilhelm II, with his obsession for the family's image, simply could not abide. He dispatched his financial ministers to assess the situation, and they returned with a horrifying report. The prince's debts were in the millions, and his spending showed no signs of slowing down. Alongside the financial crisis came a cascade of personal blunders. Friedrich Leopold seemed to possess a unique talent for saying and doing the wrong thing at the worst possible moment. During a high-profile diplomatic tour of the Far East, his conduct was so indiscreet and undignified that it caused a minor international incident, requiring the Kaiser to engage in embarrassing damage control. At home, his practical jokes grew more infamous. He became a subject of gossip and ridicule in the very circles he was supposed to command respect. He was seen as a liability, a loose cannon whose antics reflected poorly on the entire royal house. The Kaiser's response was to tighten the screws. He began by issuing direct imperial orders, forbidding the prince from undertaking foreign travel without his express permission and ordering him to curb his extravagant lifestyle. But these commands had the opposite effect. Friedrich Leopold, possessing a stubborn and defiant streak, chafed under his cousin's authoritarian hand. He saw the Kaiser's orders not as helpful guidance, but as a tyrannical infringement on his personal liberty. He began to subtly and then openly defy the emperor. He would find ways to circumvent the travel bans and continued to associate with figures the Kaiser deemed undesirable. The feud escalated from a private family matter into a direct contest of wills between two of the highest-ranking men in the German Empire. The Kaiser's inner circle, sensing the direction of the wind, began to actively work against the prince, reporting his every misdeed, often with considerable exaggeration, directly to their monarch. Prince Friedrich Leopold became an increasingly isolated figure, a man marked for destruction. By the early 1900s, Kaiser Wilhelm II had reached his breaking point. His cousin's debts were out of control, his behavior was an ongoing international embarrassment, and his defiance had become intolerable. A final secret attempt to reason with the prince failed spectacularly. The Kaiser decided that the time for warnings was over. He would employ the ultimate sanction, a legal weapon so drastic and humiliating that it was almost unthinkable to use against a prince of the blood royal. He set in motion the process of Entmündigung. Entmündigung was a concept in German civil law that allowed for a person to be declared legally incompetent. A court could strip an individual of their right to manage their own affairs if they were proven to be mentally ill, a pathological spendthrift, Verschwender, or an alcoholic. The person's property and finances would then be placed under the control of a legal guardian or trustee. It was a tool designed to protect families from a reckless member who threatened to bankrupt them. To apply this to a common citizen was a serious matter. To apply it to a great-nephew of the first emperor, a general in the Prussian army, and the Kaiser's own brother-in-law was a political earthquake. The Kaiser's legal team, acting on behalf of the crown and the head of the House of Hohenzollern, formally petitioned the courts. They began to assemble a devastating case against Prince Friedrich Leopold, documenting his insane spending, his fraudulent investments, and his erratic behavior. They painted a picture of a man who was not just irresponsible, but who was fundamentally incapable of rational thought when it came to money and his personal conduct. It was a calculated and brutal character assassination designed to publicly strip him of his credibility and his autonomy. Friedrich Leopold was stunned by the ferocity of the attack. He attempted to fight back, hiring his own lawyers to contest the petition, but he was hopelessly outmatched. His opponent was not just a cousin, it was the German emperor, a man who controlled the entire apparatus of the state. The prince had few allies left at court. Most were too afraid of the Kaiser's wrath to speak up in his defense. The legal battle was a one-sided affair. The court predictably ruled in favor of the emperor. The judgment was catastrophic. Prince Friedrich Leopold of Prussia was officially declared a Verschwender, a profligate, and was placed under legal guardianship. He was stripped of all control over his immense fortune. His estates, his palaces, his forests, and all his assets were handed over to a court-appointed administrator who answered directly to the Kaiser. The prince, who had once spent millions with the flick of a pen, was now placed on a humiliatingly strict allowance, his every expenditure scrutinized and approved by a bureaucrat. The feud was over. The Kaiser had won a total and devastating victory. Life for Prince Friedrich Leopold after the court's judgment was a descent into a quiet, gilded hell. He was a prisoner in his own paradise. He was still permitted to live at his beloved Glienicke Palace, but it was no longer his. He was a tenant in his own home, wandering through the magnificent rooms he had built, a powerless ghost surrounded by treasures he no longer controlled. The laughter and music of his once famous parties fell silent. The stream of guests who had once flocked to his lavish dinners dried up, as associating with the disgraced prince was now politically toxic. His public life was effectively over. While he retained his military titles, they were now purely ceremonial. He was never again given a meaningful command or a role of any significance. He was pointedly excluded from major state events and family gatherings. He was a non-person, a living embarrassment that the Kaiser and the court did their best to ignore. The psychological toll of this humiliation was immense. The prince, once so vibrant and rebellious, sank into a state of resigned bitterness. His famous sense of humor curdled into a sour cynicism. The disgrace had a devastating impact on his family. His wife, Princess Louise Sophie, was now tied to a man who had been publicly branded a fool. As the Kaiser and sister, her position was excruciating. She was trapped between her loyalty to her husband and her duty to her brother-in-law, the emperor. The scandal cast a long shadow over their 4 children, who grew up in a household defined by financial ruin and social isolation. They were Hohenzollern princes and princesses who were, through no fault of their own, on the outside looking in. For over a decade, Friedrich Leopold lived in this state of suspended animation, a wealthy pauper, a prince with no power, a general with no soldiers. He was a man who had flown too close to the imperial sun and had had his wings melted away, left to fall back to earth in a long, slow, and lonely descent. He had defied the iron will of the Hohenzollern system, and the system had crushed him completely. He would live just long enough to see the ultimate, terrible irony. The very system that had destroyed him would, in the fires of a world war and revolution, destroy itself. The imperial feud was over, and the victor was never in doubt. With the crushing legal judgment of Entmündigung, Kaiser Wilhelm II had utterly defeated his cousin. Prince Friedrich Leopold was left a prince in name only, a man stripped of his fortune, his autonomy, and his honor, left to live as a ward of the state in his own palace. He was a ghost at the imperial feast, a living testament to the ruthless power of the Hohenzollern system and the unforgiving nature of its ruler. But history, with its taste for grand irony, was preparing for its final act. The prince's personal war had been lost, but a far greater war was about to engulf the continent. The final chapter of his life would be that of a spectator, a man forced to watch from the sidelines as the very empire that had broken him was itself consumed by the fires of world war and revolution, leaving him to wander alone through the twilight of its ruins. By the dawn of the 20th century, Prince Friedrich Leopold of Prussia was a man comprehensively defeated. His bitter and protracted feud with his cousin, the formidable German Emperor Wilhelm II, had ended in his absolute humiliation. Stripped of control over his own fortune by the legal maneuver of Entmündigung, he was a prince in name only, a financial ward of the very state he was born to help lead. He wandered the magnificent halls and gardens of his Glienicke Palace not as its master, but as its most famous prisoner, a living ghost haunting the scenes of his former extravagance. The great imperial machine of the House of Hohenzollern, which demanded absolute conformity, had identified him as a faulty component and had ruthlessly cast him aside. His rebellion, a chaotic mix of personal indulgence and genuine defiance, had been crushed. But history has a taste for profound and terrible ironies. The prince, the outcast, the man deemed a failure by his own family, would live long enough to witness the apocalyptic destruction of the very system that had condemned him. This final chapter of his life is not about his war with the Kaiser, but about his lonely survival in its aftermath. A story of a man who lost his personal battle, but outlived the empire of his enemy, only to find himself a forgotten relic in a world of ruins. The summer of 1914 brought with it the guns of August and the beginning of the First World War. Across Germany, a wave of patriotic hysteria, the spirit of 1914, swept the nation. In the cities, crowds cheered wildly, convinced that this was Germany's moment of destiny, a short and glorious war that would solidify its place as the dominant power in the world. For the Prussian aristocracy, and especially for the princes of the House of Hohenzollern, this was the ultimate test, the moment for which their entire lives had been a preparation. Duty, honor, and glory called. Princes and dukes rushed to the front to lead their regiments, eager to prove their valor in what they imagined would be a grand chivalrous conflict. For Prince Friedrich Leopold, this moment of national crisis was the ultimate and most personal humiliation. He was, by rank, a colonel general in the Prussian army. In any normal circumstance, a prince of his standing would have been given a significant field command, perhaps leading an army corps or serving in a high-profile role on the general staff. But these were not normal circumstances. His great antagonist, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was now the supreme warlord, the commander-in-chief of all German forces, and the Kaiser had a long memory. He had no intention of allowing his disgraced and unpredictable cousin anywhere near a position of real authority, or more importantly, a position where he might win public acclaim or glory. While other royals, like Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, were leading armies and winning battles, Friedrich Leopold was deliberately sidelined. His rank was rendered meaningless, his experience ignored. He was a general with no army, a warrior with no war. The psychological toll of this emasculation must have been immense. For a Prussian prince, military service was the very core of his identity. To be denied a meaningful role in the greatest conflict in his nation's history was to be publicly branded as useless. As the war dragged on from months into years, and the initial patriotic fervor gave way to a grim struggle for survival, he was forced to watch from the periphery. He saw the sons of his friends and the men of his former regiments march off to the slaughterhouses of the Western and eastern fronts, while he remained in his palace a forgotten man. The war came for his family nonetheless, like countless other German families. Aristocratic and common alike, he was not spared the personal losses of the conflict. His youngest and perhaps most promising son, Prince Friedrich Karl, had embraced the new and dangerous technology of military aviation. He became a pilot, flying reconnaissance missions over the Western Front. In March 1917, during a mission over France, his aircraft was hit by enemy fire. He was wounded and forced to land behind Australian lines. He was taken prisoner, but his wounds were too severe. He died a few days later at the age of 23. He was awarded the Iron Cross posthumously for his bravery. For his father, it was a tragedy laced with bitter irony. His son had died a hero's death in the service of an empire that had deemed the father himself unworthy to serve. By 1918, the empire that Friedrich Karl had died for was on the verge of collapse. 4 years of horrific warfare had bled the nation white. The German army was defeated on the battlefield, and the home front was starving due to the Allied naval blockade. The spirit of 1914 was a distant, mocking memory, replaced by exhaustion, anger, and a desperate desire for peace. In late October, the German fleet at Kiel mutinied, refusing to sail out for a final suicidal battle against the British. The mutiny sparked a revolution that spread like wildfire across the country. On November 9, 1918, with Berlin in the grip of a general strike and crowds calling for his removal, Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate. He slipped out of the country and fled into exile in the neutral Netherlands. In a single stunning day, the world that had defined Friedrich Leopold's entire existence vanished. The House of Hohenzollern, which had ruled Prussia for 5 centuries and Germany for nearly 50 years, was deposed. The German Empire was replaced by a republic. All titles of nobility were abolished. Prince Friedrich Leopold of Prussia was now simply Friedrich Leopold, citizen of a defeated and chaotic New Germany. One can only imagine the complex swirl of emotions he must have felt. His great nemesis, the all-powerful Kaiser who had engineered his ruin, was now a powerless, disgraced exile, reviled by the very people he had once commanded. The entire rigid, suffocating system of protocol, privilege, and power that had both elevated and crushed him had been swept away. Was this a moment of vindication? Was it a victory to have outlasted his enemy? Or was it simply the final tragic act of a play in which he, too, was just another piece of wreckage? There could be little triumph in seeing the destruction of his own world, even if it meant the fall of his personal tyrant. He had won his freedom from the Kaiser's control, only to find himself adrift in the ruins of the society that, for all its flaws, had given his life meaning. The years that followed the revolution were a time of chaos and hardship for Germany. The Weimar Republic, the new democratic government, struggled to cope with the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles, political extremism from both the left and the right, and a devastating economic crisis that culminated in the hyperinflation of 1923. For the former aristocracy, it was a period of profound dislocation. Their properties were often confiscated or heavily taxed, their social status evaporated, and they were frequently blamed for the catastrophe of the war. For Friedrich Leopold, already financially crippled long before the revolution, these years were a slow fade into obscurity. He was now an old man, a relic of a vanished era. The grand scandals and imperial feuds that had once defined his life seemed like tales from another planet in the gritty, desperate reality of post-war Berlin. He lived a quiet, secluded life, his health in decline, watching as the nation he had known dissolved into a state of permanent crisis. And yet fate had one final devastating blow in store for him. The deepest tragedy of his life came not from a Kaiser or a revolution, but from a simple, terrible accident. His second son, Prince Friedrich Sigismund, had survived the war and had become a man of considerable accomplishment. Unlike his father, he was disciplined and respected. A decorated war hero, he had channeled his energies into equestrianism, becoming one of Germany's most skilled and celebrated horsemen. He was in many ways the son who had redeemed the family name. In June of 1927, while competing at an international tournament in Lucerne, Switzerland, tragedy struck. As he was guiding his horse over a difficult water jump, the animal stumbled. Horse and rider went down in a terrible tangle. Friedrich Sigismund was crushed. He died from his injuries a few hours later. He was just 35 years old. The news was a national tragedy in Germany, and for his aging father it was the ultimate, unbearable sorrow. He had lost his youngest son to war, his eldest son to disgrace, and now his most accomplished and beloved son to a random act of fate. It was the final cruel twist in a life filled with loss and disappointment, a moment of pure human grief that overshadowed all the imperial drama that had come before. Prince Friedrich Leopold of Prussia died 4 years later, on September 13, 1931, at his estate in Silesia. He was 66 years old. He did not live to see the final dark chapter of Germany's 20th century tragedy. He died just 2 years before the Nazi Party came to power, and he was spared the knowledge of the new and terrible world they would create, a world that would persecute and ultimately destroy many of his class and kind. The legacy of Prince Friedrich Leopold is a complex and melancholy one. He is not remembered in the grand halls of German history as a great general, a wise statesman, or a noble prince. He is remembered, if at all, as a failure, the black sheep, the royal buffoon, the man who embarrassed a dynasty. But perhaps this simple judgment misses the deeper, more tragic truth of his life. He was undoubtedly a flawed man, impulsive, irresponsible, and maddeningly self-indulgent. But his story is also that of a man who refused, or was simply unable, to be squeezed into the mold that his birth had prepared for him. His personal rebellion, however misguided and self-destructive, served to expose the deep cracks in the magnificent but brittle facade of the German Empire, a system so obsessed with uniformity that it had no room for a single, flawed individual, was a system already doomed to collapse. In the end, Prince Friedrich Leopold is best understood as a casualty of an era. He was a man whose personal failings were magnified and ultimately crushed by a system that demanded a perfection no human can truly achieve. His story is a powerful, intimate reminder of the corrosive nature of absolute power and the deep human cost of a society that prizes conformity above all else. His ruined palace at Glienicke stands today as a quiet, beautiful monument, not just to the folly of one prince, but to the arrogance of an entire empire that believed it was eternal, and to the black sheep who outlived the shepherd and the flock, only to find himself alone in a ruined pasture.